My presentation actually dovetails quite nicely with the previous presentation, because we're going to be talking about fundamentally group projects and the pitfalls with those and how we can overcome those. Yesterday, my colleague Peter Melilou was talking about formally the online tools that you can use to help facilitate peer feedback and peer assessment. And I'm not going to go over that today. I'm just going to be talking about the theory and the practice of that, and being platform agnostic around that. So every year, there's an organization in the United States called the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And they survey businesses, and they ask them a lot of questions, primarily around what are they looking for in graduates. And this last year, these are the attributes that these employers said are most important. Now, through the years, this doesn't change much, right? You might get some moving up and some down, but those are principally what those have held constant now for a while. And so tertiary has replied by saying, yeah, we can certainly teach those, the fundamental, the core concepts, the knowledge part, but we can also play a part in teaching these soft skills that employers are looking for. And what we've collectively decided is that we're going to do this through group work. Unfortunately, this typically means that a lecturer will say, all right, guys, we've got a group project coming up. Form your own teams. Here's the assessment instructions. If you have any problems, let me know. Good luck. And as students, things seem to go along pretty nicely because they actually don't start until the very last minute. So the teacher is thinking, things seem to be going really well. I asked the students, how are things going? They're going great, boss. No problems there, because they haven't started. So once they actually get started, that's when the problems start, right? So there are some inherent drawbacks of group assignments, both from a student perspective and from a lecturer perspective. So from a teacher perspective, these are quite serious, actually. So verification of individual achievement, required learning outcomes, and the allocation of fair marks. Another thing that we typically do is say, determining who's contributed what is really hard, and actually putting a numerical score against that, hard to do. So we're going to let everybody have that same grade, right? So the team gets an 80, everybody gets an 80, regardless if one person does very little and one person does a lot. That typically results in free riders, right? So you're always going to get one or two that if they know that everybody gets the same grade, they're going to do as little as possible, right? Because there's no penalty in it for them. There may be a social penalty, right? A little bit of stigma saying, Peter's a horrible group member, but guess what? Peter still gets the same grade. So that leads to social, that free rider or social loafing. So these drawbacks, they tend to form common problems, and this is illustrated in the literature. One that I'd like to highlight here is engaging the other. By the other, I'm talking about diversity here, right? Where there may be one or two outliers in terms of being in the minority, and it's hard to engage that. Diversity. We all love it, right? Or we would love it if all of these pieces fit nicely together to form a beautiful mosaic. And that is the holy grail of group projects, when you can get a diverse group to work well together because the output that they do is fantastic. If that ever happens, it's typically by chance, right? It just serendipitously appears. So, academics have given this a lot of thought as well. How do we coordinate these pieces to make sure they fit. We'll use Myers-Briggs personalities. We'll put this personality, yeah? Or Strengths Finder, same thing. The problem is that we don't have the luxury, right, of establishing, running our students through a Myers-Briggs or a Strengths Finder to then go, okay, spend an evening or two, dutifully putting things together. It doesn't work like that. We just don't have that luxury of time. What's interesting is that a few years back, Google started looking at the issue of teams and trying to identify what are the factors that make an effective team. Google is made up of hundreds of teams. And so they've got a great sandbox there to do the research with. And what's interesting is that Google has found through their Aristotle project that it really isn't team membership at all that affects whether or not a team is effective. It's the psychological conditions that are present. Number one, first and foremost, is psychological safety. I'll get to that definition in just a second. Psychological safety, number one. Number two, dependability. Can I rely on my team members to actually do what they say they're going to do? Structure and clarity, well, from an academic point of view, yeah, that's us providing that structure and clarity around what the goals and objectives are. Whether it's meaningful, having an assessment like the previous two had presented, that is a meaningful assessment. Yeah, students understand that. And then the impact. What kind of an impact is our team making? Quickly, psychological safety. Very important, right? So it refers to an individual's perception of the consequences of taking an interpersonal risk or a belief that a team is safe for risk-taking in the face of being seen as ignorant, incompetent, negative, or disruptive. Now, let you finish that. What's interesting is that do you think that it's more likely or less likely if you have a diverse, teams of diverse learners, whether or not psychological safety is going to be present or not? That is to say, I believe that as diversity goes like this, the likelihood of psychological safety goes like this, right? So if we want diverse learners, that's what we have. If we want to create the best teams or to make sure that our teams succeed in a diverse learning environment, the first thing that we need to do is make sure that psychological safety is present. And so, this is the question, right? Can teammate peer feedback enhance psychological safety and dependability? And that's what we're working on. We think that is the case, and we'll talk about that. So generally speaking, my partner and I, educators, Peter has been an educator for a lot longer than I have, but doing the literature and coming up with how do we best support teams, peer feedback and peer assessment kept coming up. And these are the benefits that peer feedback through the literature highlights, right? So it improves the effectiveness of teams, increasing competition, decreasing the free riding, and then providing positive effects on student learning, including increased participation, critical thinking, etc.
Increased cooperation.
Increased cooperation. So my partner, Peter, has been thinking about this a lot. And this is his causal feedback loop, which I'm going to bring him up to explain, because I think that it does a really good job of how psychological safety fits into all of this.
Right, thank you. So I introduced a little bit of this yesterday. The way a causal loop works is that this is, over here is an X, the contribution, and over here, where the arrow points to is a Y. So the more individual contribution you make to your team, the more of X, the more will be the result that team produces. More contribution, more team result. Down here, more motivation, increases my contribution, which leads to a higher team result. Level 2, we put in some peer assessment. When we put in peer assessment, and we heard that from the literature, as you put peer assessment into team and group assignments, several things happen, and that's what all the arrows do, going in various directions. As we put in peer assessment, two things. First, when your personal result is moderated by your contribution and the peer assessment that you get, your personal result is going to be above the average, above the team result, or less than the team result based on your peer assessment. The second thing that your peer assessment makes possible is that you give feedback to the other members of your team. So you give feedback or you receive feedback from your team members about why they rated you high and why they rated you low. You might engage subsequently in courageous conversations about that. So as you get peer feedback, and as the quality of that peer feedback increases, we get the sense of fairness that, okay, I understand the results now. I realize I did poorly, and now I understand why. That sense of understanding the fairness of the peer assessment raises your motivation and raises your contribution, which raises both the team result and the peer assessment and raises the personal result. So here, this loop is a virtuous loop. It's a reinforcing loop. Positive feedback. Things get better and better. So there's other loops in here. Ultimately, this talk is about enhancing employability, teamwork skills, cooperation, things like that. Employability is increased by two things. One, the personal result the students get. The higher their academic achievement measured by their personal results, they become more employable. Secondly, the teamwork competencies that they have developed through their teamwork. As those get higher, again, their employability, measured in various ways, increases. Now, let's look at psychological safety. Up here we've got team motivation and dynamics. And psychological safety is one of the measures that we would measure as part of measuring the quality of team motivation and dynamics. So if we have high team motivation and good team dynamics, including high psychological safety, then again, we get a better team result. So where does that high team motivation and dynamics come from? It comes from these teamwork competencies that have developed magically somehow. How have they developed? Through the peer feedback you've received from your team members, but also crucially from team training. And Patrick will go into this, don't want to steal his thunder. So the team training is crucial. We mentioned it yesterday. Team training and how to conduct teamwork activities is useful in raising all these good things, employability and psychological safety. But it's also important in terms of raising the quality of peer assessment and peer feedback which is given. So you've just done really well, because that's an hour's lecture and about a really thick paper which I've scrunched into about 5 minutes. There are some zeros on here, and that means opposing. That means free riding. The higher is free riding, the lower is team motivation and team dynamics. That's so. But most of the things are positive. This is a reinforcing cycle. Patrick.
So how do we do it? 3 things. First thing is they have to understand that their contribution or lack of contribution is going to have consequences. Those consequences are reflected in their grade for the project, right? So not everybody gets the same grade. Your grade is going to be based on the contribution that you make to the team, and that is going to be assessed via your peers. Second is, you need to introduce what it is that you're actually being assessed on. What does it mean to be a good team member? What are those attributes that identify good team membership? And go over those, and I'll talk about that in a bit of depth in just a second. And then the final one is how to give and receive feedback. So Peter and I have kind of developed a system, and we've said at a bare minimum, you need to have that initial briefing of identifying what those attributes are for good team membership, how you're going to be assessed, etc. And then you'll jump into, at the end of the project, a summative peer assessment that results in a team result and a personal result. Ideally, however, though, that between the initial briefing and the end, you have a formative peer assessment halfway through the project, where if things have gone off the rails, that through peer assessment and peer feedback, they can go, oh, I didn't realize Peter thought that I wasn't doing as much, or that Steve didn't think I was doing as much. I need to get it picked. I need to pull up my socks and get going. And so if you do it halfway through the project, there's still plenty of opportunity to get back on the train and finish up strong. The introduction to peer assessment and those attributes. So we have a system that assesses students based on 10 attributes. 5 are around contribution to task, and 5 are around team leadership and harmony. And what I like to do at the outset is, once the students are in their teams, is to assign them. I hand out the rubric and say, okay, team 1, you guys are in charge of telling me what it looks like, average or normal. Yeah. What are the behaviors that you would expect to see for initiative? This is a Likert scale, an average and normal for 3 and 5. And I hand out that task to all of the teams, so that at the end of it, we have a completed, co-created rubric that everybody understands. If I want to get a 5 for focus, I need to do X, Y, and Z, right? Or if I do this, I can expect to get a 3. So if you can do a 5 and a 3, then students understand, well, okay, so it's not quite a 5, but not quite a 3, so it's a 4 or less than that, right? So all you need to do is have them complete the 3 and the 5. You've got a co-created rubric, off you go, right? So students have a shared understanding of what needs to happen and what needs to take place in order to be a good team member. These last 5 you can see are focus, encouragement, welcoming listener, and harmony. And all of those things, I think, when brought together, help establish a sense of psychological safety, if everybody's doing that well. We are really bad at giving and receiving feedback naturally. Yeah, we avoid it. In the classroom, it's expected that as a lecturer, I'm going to provide my students feedback. They understand that. Yeah, that's what they've grown up with. It's harder, though, colleague to colleague, to give and receive feedback, and even harder if you're a peer, a student, to give each other feedback. We don't know how to do it, and when it's done, typically it's both on the giving and the receiving side. So there's a nice little framework that I use that's called the bet and the bear, and we practice this. So for positive feedback, we do the BET model, which is I have the students identify a behavior. Antoinette, your leadership, there's the behavior, then I need to identify the effect. Your leadership has really strengthened our team. It provides a motivation for everybody to do better, and the T stands for thank you. So thank you for that. So we go through that, and we in our teams, each week practice that, giving one BET feedback. Yeah, identify the positive behavior, what that effect is, thank you very much. Students love that. Yeah, and it's easy. And what's nice about this is that you've taken the personality out of it, right? It's not focused on the person, it's focused on the behavior. Identify it, give the effect, thank you. When we want to give critical behavior, we use the bear model. We identify the behavior. Peter, your tardiness to group projects, the behavior, your tardiness to group projects has a real negative effect on the team. We can't get started. Other people have commitments that they have to give up because of your tardiness, so there's the effect. The A is the alternative. If you showed up on time, that's the alternative. The result would be, that we could be more effective and efficient during our 1 hour allocated time meetings. Yeah. Behavior, effect that behavior has, suggest an alternative. And if they did that, if they adopted that alternative, what would the result be?
Thank you, Patrick.
You're welcome, Peter. And so we see that it is. Feedback is a gift. If I give Peter feedback, if he takes on board that feedback, he understands that he's going to be better for it. Students love that. How do we do peer feedback and peer assessment? This is the agnostic part. If you're doing this as a paper-based, I started out doing Google Forms and just collecting it that way. It's hard, it's messy, it's time-consuming, but you can do it. There are other platforms. Peter and I have been working on this for 6 years, developing a platform called PeerAssess Pro that does all of this for you. But there are other platforms like iPeer or Teammates or Spark Plus. All fantastic, right? The point is that I really want to impart with you is that if you do group projects, do them well. Provide the students with the tools, that they can use to improve their career readiness competencies. That's what we're here for, right? Provide them the tools. They'll do it. It gets better. Group projects don't have to be a disaster. In fact, when you do it well, it is amazing, and students will love it. Just really quickly, this is a graph from ours, and you can see that once the feedback is in, you can see where your class fits along all of these attributes. And so you can see chairmanship is quite low. Well, this is, especially if you do this in a formative halfway through, you can say, okay guys, it looks like we have a problem with chairmanship. What can we do to improve this? Or if we have a problem with recommendation or conflict management, we can identify that early on and work towards helping to sculpt and shape that. Whew. Questions? Yeah, thank you.
Do you advocate tutor control over team formation, or do you allow your students to do it themselves?
No. So I never allow. So I always form the teams because if you allow, and this is why, because if you allow students to form their own teams, they're going to be very homogenous. They're going to be with like-minded people, with their mates, etc. That's the easiest way to have a group project go okay, right? Because they already know each other. But you're not going to get the whole value of diversity yet when you place them in teams and really give them the tools to make that diversity work.
Sorry, a follow-up question. How do you make those choices? Do you just randomly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or do you?
So typically my group projects are near the end of the semester, and so I base it typically by capability first. So I'll always put a top student on each team, and then a couple of middle students, and then a couple of the bottom end students.
How do the top students feel about that?
They don't know how I do it.
You don't think they can really like?
Oh, well, okay, so we just work together to get it done.
Do you assess at all teamwork? Rather than the end product of a team project, do you assess the teamwork itself, and then you're looking at their evaluations?
Yeah. So they peer assess the teamwork. I assess that end product at the end, and the product at the end plus their peer assess scores necessarily derives the individual score.
But that's still. I think it's very difficult to separate out that end product and their relative weightings depending on their efforts and so on, but to actually assess the effectiveness of teamwork, they do overlap, but how do you really evaluate the teamwork?
I don't. I assess the output. They assess the teamwork.
And you trained them to assess the quality of the teamwork processes.
Okay.
Yeah, and the quality of the contribution.
Mm-hmm.
You train them to do that.
Okay, yeah.
And if they don't do that well, they all get the same team result. Yeah.
Kia ora, I'm Lee
Kia
from
ora.
EIT.
We've met.
We have met, Patrick, yes. I have a question around the current discussions around ensuring that all learners meet all learning outcomes.
Yeah.
How does that play out in your breakdown of marking the peer assessment piece? When there is a student who doesn't participate or contribute as much, do they actually meet the learning outcome if the end product meets the learning outcome? How do you weight that?
So I'd start by saying how do you determine that if you give everybody the group score? Yeah, I don't think that you can. I think that if you've assessed the output, and that two, if your class has done the peer assessment and they've done a good honest job, that will necessarily show you who has contributed to the output of that and scored accordingly, so that you can have on our platform you can have a team that gets a group score of say 75 or 80, and an outstanding team member that gets into the 90s, the high 90s, and one that has done very little that's down into the 60s, 50s, 40s, even lower.
So you'd scale the end mark on the product based on
Their
what
peer
they were given in
assessment.
their peer assessment.
And so I presume that there's some learning outcome around teamwork?
That's the time. So unfortunately, I don't. So the question. This is a very good question. Do you have learning outcomes that specifically say something about teamwork? Well, no. I don't think many of us do have. I wish they would.
How can you fail a student on something that's not a learning outcome?
How can you give credit to somebody who hasn't done anything?
Yeah.
Graduate profiles, though. And
Exactly.
It's the same with application of educational technologies. We may not be actually assessing that, but we're applying the use of educational technologies in an assessment process. So I think the same applies for team.
Yes.
That kind of team.
I would love to encourage this conversation to continue over morning tea, but I would really like us to move on to our last presenters today. So there are people waiting to come in, and just one last changeover, and we can thank you so much. Good conversation, and only half an hour for morning tea.